I never imagined I would end up telling this story. To you. To anyone. It's not the kind of thing you share easily, especially when you know the hurt, the regret, and the damage it brings. My name is Sarah. And what I'm about to tell you is my truth. My experience. It starts like so many stories do, with an ordinary day. A day that felt like it was going to be just another one in a long line of days. But in a single moment, everything changed. What happened next? Well, I wish I could say I saw it coming. But no one does. There are moments in life when you think you have everything under control. But the truth is, control is an illusion. It's like being in a car, driving straight down a road, thinking everything's fine, until the moment when the road turns and you realize you're headed straight towards something you can't avoid. I thought I had everything. A loving husband, a stable home. I should have been content, but that's the thing about life. Sometimes, even when you have it all, you still feel like something's missing. Something you can't put your finger on. I didn't know it then, but that something was about to show up in my life in a way I couldn't have imagined. It wasn't anything dramatic. It didn't feel like the movies. It started with a text. A simple, innocent message. At first, it didn't seem like anything. Just a casual conversation. But when you're looking for something, or maybe when you're just feeling lost, those small things, those little words, they can mean more than they should. I was lonely. I'll admit it. Not because my husband wasn't there, but because somewhere along the way, we'd drifted. Slowly. Without even noticing. And then this message, it became a connection. A way out. At least, that's what I told myself. I had met him through a friend of a friend. Someone who, at the time, seemed harmless enough. Just another person in the crowd of faces you see every day but don't really know. But we started talking. At first, it was casual. Then, it became intimate. You might think I should have known better. That I should have ended it before it went too far. But sometimes, when you're seen, when someone finally notices you, it's hard to walk away from that. I began lying to myself. I told myself it was harmless. Just a flirtation. Nothing serious. But even I knew, deep down, that I was crossing a line. That I was opening a door I couldn't close once I walked through it. It didn't take long before I was meeting him in person. The first time was a lunch. Nothing special. But once we were alone, it felt different. There was this intensity between us. It felt like I could breathe again. I was falling for him. And the worst part? I didn't even care. I didn't care about my husband. I didn't care about the consequences. All I cared about was how he made me feel. Like I was something worth noticing. I thought I could keep it under control. But if you've ever been in a situation like this, you know how it goes. You think you're in control, but one day, you wake up and realize that the one thing you thought you could manage, the truth, was slipping through your fingers. I never thought my life would unravel this way. I never imagined that a single choice, a single moment, could change everything. But as much as I tried to ignore it, as much as I told myself that I wasn't doing anything wrong, I knew the truth. The truth is, nothing lasts forever. Not love. Not trust. And certainly not secrets. What happened next? I wish I could say I had a choice. But that night, something happened, something that I could never take back. And that's where this story truly begins. If you're finding yourself drawn into this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter of this wild love story. Before it all began, things in my life weren't perfect, but they weren't bad either. I had a husband I thought I could count on, a life that felt steady. But, sometimes, steady doesn't mean fulfilling. Sometimes, you live with a quiet dissatisfaction that you can't really explain. It's like being in a room that's supposed to be warm, but there's this constant draft you can't seem to locate. You don't realize it's there until you start feeling cold. I know now that I was searching for something I didn't even know I needed at the time. I thought I was just tired. Tired of routine. Tired of conversations that felt empty. Tired of coming home every night to a man who, in a way, had stopped seeing me. And I don't blame him, really. We were both to blame, and neither of us ever said it out loud. It wasn't that my husband wasn't a good man. He was. In many ways, he was everything I'd ever wanted. He was dependable, reliable, stable. He had a good job, a good heart, and he was a good father. But after years of being together, things started to feel different. The small gestures, those little moments that once made us laugh and connect, stopped happening. He worked long hours. I got busy with my own things. We'd eat dinner in front of the TV, each of us lost in our own world. It wasn't like the love had disappeared. It just felt distant. Like we were living parallel lives. We didn't argue. We didn't fight. But it was the silence that hurt. The silence of a marriage where both people were there but somehow not really present. The silence of unspoken words, of unaddressed needs. I couldn't put my finger on what was wrong, but I could feel it every day, like a heavy weight in my chest. And then, there he was. This man, who, at the time, seemed like a distraction, a small spark in a life that felt like it was fading into the background. He wasn't what I'd expected. I'd never intended to cheat. Never thought I'd be the type of woman who would step outside the boundaries of my vows. But when he first reached out, it felt innocent enough. Just a message. A comment on a post. A few jokes here and there. And then, over time, the conversations deepened. It wasn't about sex. Not at first. It wasn't like that. It was the way he listened. The way he saw me, really saw me. He listened when I talked about my day, my frustrations. He asked questions about things my husband never asked. And in those moments, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel like a role in someone else's life. I felt important. I think that's what people don't understand about affairs. It's not just about physical attraction or even love. Sometimes it's just about being seen. When you've spent years feeling like you're drifting through life without a connection, even the smallest acknowledgement can feel like a lifeline. But then, of course, I knew better. I knew this wasn't the right thing. I knew I was crossing a line, one that I couldn't uncross. I knew it was dangerous, that this was going to lead me down a road I might not be able to come back from. But still, I kept talking to him. I kept texting. I kept meeting him. And slowly, without realizing it, I was opening myself up to something that would change my life forever. I remember the first time I met him in person. It was supposed to be casual. Just coffee. But the moment we sat down, it felt different. It wasn't just two people having a conversation. It was two people who, for a brief second, felt like they understood each other in a way no one else did. I knew it was wrong. But at the same time, I felt alive again in a way I hadn't felt in years. The weight of my life, the weight of my marriage, all seemed to fade into the background. It was only after I left that coffee shop that I started to feel the guilt. The guilt hit me like a wave. I walked back to my car, feeling as though I had betrayed everything I'd ever known. Everything I was. And yet, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I couldn't stop replaying every word, every glance. The touch of his hand. The way he smiled at me as though I was the only person in the room. I didn't want to be that person. I didn't want to be the person who cheated. Who betrayed trust. But I was already in too deep. And that was the hardest part, to admit that I had already crossed a line that could never be erased. As the days went on, it became harder and harder to keep the facade. The calls, the texts, the secret meetings, it felt like I was leading two separate lives, and neither of them felt real anymore. I wasn't the woman my husband thought I was. I wasn't the woman I thought I was either. And the worst part was, I wasn't even sure who I was anymore. I didn't know if I was still the woman my husband had married, or if I had just become someone else entirely. I wasn't sure if I was doing this for me or for him. If I was searching for something missing in my marriage, or if I was just escaping the truth I didn't want to face. It was during this time, as the guilt started to build up inside me, that things with my husband started to feel even more distant. Not because he was any different, but because I was. I couldn't look him in the eyes without feeling like a stranger. I couldn't have a conversation with him without wondering if he knew. I kept waiting for him to ask the questions I didn't want to answer. And yet, he never did. He was there, but he wasn't. He had his own life, his own distractions. Our conversations were polite, routine. And in some ways, that made it worse. Because the truth is, when you're hiding something, it's not the betrayal that's the hardest part, it's the silence that surrounds it. That's when the lies began. Little ones at first. Just small things I could justify. A late meeting here, a missed phone call there. But over time, those little lies began to pile up, and soon, they weren't so little anymore. I had created a story in my head to justify everything, why I was meeting him, why I was texting him, why I was keeping secrets. But deep down, I knew the truth. And I knew that if I didn't stop, if I didn't confront the truth, everything would eventually come crashing down. But here's the thing about lies, they always have a way of coming to the surface. And when they do, they don't come quietly. I was living two lives. One at home, with my husband, and another in secret, with someone who was never supposed to be more than just a distraction. But somewhere along the way, the lines started to blur. I started to feel like maybe this wasn't just an affair. Maybe it was something more. I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know how to undo what had already been set in motion. The more I tried to convince myself it was just a phase, the more I realized. I didn't want it to end. Not yet. And that's the moment I should have stopped. That's the moment I should have stepped back and taken a hard look at what I was doing. But I didn't. I kept going, kept feeding the lies, kept walking further into the maze I had created for myself. And each step I took, I knew that something was coming, something I couldn't escape. Maybe you've been there. Maybe you've been in a relationship where you felt like you were drifting. Where you couldn't even recognize who you were anymore, but you couldn't find your way back. Maybe you've had moments where you've lied to yourself, convincing yourself that it's not as bad as it seems. That the things you're doing don't matter. But let me tell you, they do. And when the truth catches up to you, it will be far worse than any lie you ever told yourself. I should have stopped then. I should have turned around. But I didn't. And that's when everything started to change. At first, it was just a simple escape, a brief moment away from everything. But over time, it became something more. The moments I spent with him started to feel like the only times I was truly alive. The reality of my marriage, the disconnection, the silence between me and my husband, it all felt distant when I was with him. I didn't want to admit it, but with every text, every secret meeting, I was beginning to feel like I was losing control. And not just of the affair, but of myself. I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. Someone I didn't want to be. It wasn't just about sex. It wasn't even about love, at least not in the way I'd always understood it. It was about feeling seen again. Feeling wanted. Something I had been missing for so long. The affair was intoxicating. Every time we met, it felt like the world was falling away. I'd forget everything, the guilt, the doubt, the questions, and just focus on him. On the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel like I mattered. I didn't want it to end, even though I knew deep down that I was digging myself into a hole that would be impossible to climb out of. But what I didn't realize was how quickly things could spiral. It wasn't long before it wasn't just the occasional text or casual lunch. It was more. It was longer conversations, secret meetings, more touching, things that shouldn't have been happening. Every touch, every glance, felt like a thread pulling me further away from everything I had once known. And the hardest part? The hardest part was that I didn't want to stop. I couldn't stop. It was like I had become addicted to this feeling of escape, to this version of myself that didn't exist in my real life. It was a fantasy. A brief moment where I could pretend to be someone else, someone who wasn't tied down by obligations and expectations. And at the same time, it was a slow suffocation. Each moment with him felt like a breath of fresh air, but the longer I breathed it in, the more I lost sight of who I really was. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself questioning everything. Was this really who I was now? Was I the person who betrayed my husband's trust? Was I the woman who was willing to risk everything for a fleeting connection? I couldn't answer those questions. And the more I tried to bury them, the louder they became. One day, things reached a tipping point. I was at home, standing in front of the mirror, getting ready for another meeting with him, when I caught my reflection. I looked different. My eyes weren't the same. I saw someone who was torn between two lives, someone who was slipping away from the woman she used to be. And in that moment, I felt a deep sadness that washed over me, as if I was grieving something I couldn't quite put into words. I couldn't keep doing this. But the problem was, I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know how to go back to what I had before, the marriage, the home, the life. I wasn't even sure I wanted to anymore. The more I was with him, the more distant my husband seemed. The more I lied, the more I became someone I didn't recognize. It was like I was walking away from my life with each passing day, and the person I was with him seemed like the only real part of me left. I remember the first time I had to lie to my husband about where I was. It was something simple. A work-late excuse. But when I said it, I felt this coldness settle in my chest. I hated myself for it. And yet, I did it again. And again. Each lie felt like a brick in a wall I was building between us, a wall I wasn't sure I could tear down once it was up. And then the messages started to change. They weren't just innocent anymore. The lines between us blurred, and I could feel the shift, like the air had thickened between us. He started to talk about things I didn't know how to answer. Things about the future, about how he felt about me. He told me things that made my heart race, things that made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. He told me I was different, special. He made me believe that this secret, this affair, was more than just an escape. That it was something real. I didn't want to believe him, but I did. I couldn't help it. It felt real. The connection was real. The emotions were real. And every time we met, I felt more and more like I was becoming part of his world, and less like I belonged in my own. But even as the affair deepened, I knew what I was doing was wrong. I knew it wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about my marriage. It was about the trust one had shattered and the person I was becoming. I had to ask myself, what do I want? Do I want to keep pretending this is just a phase? Or do I want to face the truth about myself, about my marriage, and about the consequences of my actions? The guilt started to eat at me. Not just for the affair, but for the lies I'd told. For the time I'd stolen from my family. And as I tried to bury it all beneath layers of excuses and justifications, it only grew stronger, harder to ignore. There were nights when I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how it had all come to this. How had I let this happen? How had I let myself fall so far from the person I thought I was? But no matter how many times I tried to pull back, something always brought me back to him. Something pulled me back to the lies, back to the secret meetings, back to the world I had created. And I knew, somewhere deep down, that I was no longer in control of what was happening. Everything changed when I found myself making excuses to leave more often. Work, errands, friends, anything to give me an excuse to be out of the house. I was addicted to the rush, to the secret life I was living. The fear, the excitement, the guilt, it was all a cocktail that kept me coming back for more. And in that twisted way, I was hooked. One afternoon, I remember standing at the edge of the balcony, my phone in my hand, waiting for a message from him. My husband was inside, flipping through the mail, completely unaware of the storm brewing just beyond the door. And there, in that moment, I realized something I hadn't wanted to face. I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know how to walk away. And I didn't know if I even wanted to. It was in those quiet moments, when no one was watching, that I started to see the truth about myself. I wasn't just betraying my husband. I was betraying me. The person I had once been, the person I had promised to be in this marriage, I was losing her, and I didn't know how to find her again. But by the time I understood all of this, it was already too late. The damage had been done. The lies had been told, the trust had been broken, and I was already too far gone to turn back. Where does it go from here? How far can you go before you can't turn back? I was standing at a crossroads in my life, though I didn't know it yet. Every choice I had made, every step I had taken toward him, was leading me to a place where there would be no escape. And the scariest part? I still didn't know if I wanted to escape. For weeks, I'd been living on the edge, feeling the weight of the lies pressing down on me, but it wasn't until that one afternoon that I finally realized how far gone I really was. It started like any other day. My husband was at work, my kids were at school, and I was planning to meet him again. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't just feeling guilty, I felt trapped. The guilt that had been building inside me for weeks finally began to suffocate me. Every time I saw my husband, I felt like a stranger. The small talk, the polite smiles, the polite gestures, they were all just reminders of what I had done. It wasn't even about him anymore. It was about me. I couldn't look at him without seeing the betrayal in my own eyes. I couldn't touch him without feeling disgusted by myself. And that's when it hit me, I had lost the ability to care about anything other than the secret I was keeping. That's the thing about living a double life. It's not the deception that hurts the most. It's the disconnect. I wasn't just lying to my husband, I was lying to myself. I was pretending that this affair, this escape, was everything I needed. But the truth was, the more I fed into it, the more I lost touch with who I was, with who I had been. And the more I lost myself, the more I began to realize how much I had destroyed in the process. The breaking point came that afternoon. I had just sent him a message, asking him to meet up at a park near my house. He agreed, of course. But this time, something felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. My heart was pounding in my chest. As I stood there, looking at myself in the bathroom mirror, I felt like I was looking at someone I didn't recognize. For the first time, I asked myself, is this who I want to be? Was I willing to throw away everything, my marriage, my family, my integrity, for this fleeting, dangerous connection? And the worst part? I didn't know the answer. I didn't know what I wanted anymore. I drove to the park, each mile stretching out in front of me like an endless road. The further I went, the more I could feel the weight of what I was doing. This wasn't just a secret affair anymore. It was a life I had built outside of my own, and I didn't know how to untangle it. When I got there, he was already waiting. He was standing by the fence, looking just like he always did, hands in his pockets, waiting for me like nothing in the world mattered except for us. He smiled when he saw me, and for a split second, I felt like I could forget everything, forget who I was, forget the man I had betrayed, forget my kids. Just feel for a moment. But as soon as he reached for me, I froze. For the first time, I didn't want him to touch me. For the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to be there at all. The feelings of guilt, of doubt, were overwhelming. I looked at him, and all I saw was a man who had no idea how much he was costing me. He didn't know the price I was paying to keep this secret, to keep pretending that this was some kind of romance, a happy affair where we were the stars, and everything else just faded away. He leaned in, kissing me softly, and I let him. But I wasn't really there. I wasn't in that moment. I was somewhere else, caught in the overwhelming wave of everything I had sacrificed, everything I had ruined. And I couldn't breathe. I pulled away from him, feeling suffocated by the weight of it all. I can't keep doing this, I whispered, more to myself than to him. I saw the confusion in his eyes. He didn't understand. Of course he didn't understand. How could he? I had built this whole fantasy world around us, and now, in that moment, I was trying to escape it. What do you mean? He asked, his voice tight. I could see the hurt in his eyes, the realization that something had shifted. And that's when I knew I had pushed him too far. The lie had gone on for too long, and the truth was finally starting to claw its way to the surface. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't know what. And that terrified me. I need to think, I said, my voice shaking. I turned around and started to walk away, my steps quickening as the guilt swelled in my chest. But I could feel him following me. He didn't know how to let go. And neither did I. I got in my car and drove off, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what I wanted. I just knew that I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep living this lie. And yet, as I sped away, part of me didn't want to leave him behind. I didn't want to lose this part of me, the part that had felt alive, the part that had been seen. But I was also scared. Scared of what would happen if I kept going down this path. Scared of what I would lose, what I had already lost. As I drove home, the weight of everything hit me all at once. I pulled into the driveway and sat in my car for a moment, staring at the front door. It was a door I had walked through 1,000 times before, but this time everything felt different. It felt like the door to a life I no longer knew how to live. My husband was inside, waiting for me. He didn't know what I had been doing, where I had been. He didn't know that the woman who walked through that door wasn't the same woman who had left in the morning. He didn't know how far I had gone, how far I had let myself drift. I went inside, trying to keep it together. Trying to act normal. But I wasn't normal anymore. I wasn't even sure who I was anymore. That night, everything changed. My life, my marriage, it was all hanging by a thread. And the next morning, I would have to face the consequences. But in that moment, I had no idea just how close I was to losing everything. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind wouldn't stop racing. The weight of everything, the affair, the lies, the betrayal, I couldn't escape it. It was like a fog that surrounded me, suffocating every thought, every breath. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my husband's face, the man I had once promised to love, to stay true to, and yet here I was, on the verge of destroying everything we had built. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to come clean, to confess everything. But every time I thought about it, I froze. I couldn't bring myself to speak the truth. How could I explain something that I didn't even fully understand myself? How could I ask for forgiveness when I wasn't even sure I deserved it? Eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep, but even then, the dreams weren't peaceful. They were fragmented, twisted versions of the life I had been living. I was trapped in a cycle I couldn't break, caught between the man I loved and the man I was betraying. Neither one of them knew the full truth, and neither one of them could see the darkness that was creeping closer and closer, threatening to consume everything. When I woke up the next morning, it felt like the world was closing in. The reality of what I had done hit me with full force. The lies, the secrets, they had finally caught up with me. I couldn't keep running. I had to face it. I had to face him. I had to face myself. But before I could even begin to prepare for that conversation, something happened. Something I never could have predicted. Something that would change everything. I was running late that day. As usual. Between my work, the kids, and everything else, I was constantly on the go. I had just dropped the kids off at school and was heading to a meeting, or at least that's what I told myself I was doing. The truth was, I was meeting him again. I didn't want to, a part of me was terrified of seeing him again, but I couldn't resist. I couldn't let go. I was addicted to the feeling of being wanted, of being seen, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. I was on my way to meet him, driving down a quiet street when it happened. Out of nowhere, the car in front of me slammed on its brakes. I didn't even have time to react. My foot slammed into the brake pedal, but it was too late. Everything happened in an instant. The screech of the tires, the impact, and then, nothing. I don't remember much after that. My head was spinning, the car shaking violently. I could hear the sound of metal crunching, glass shattering, but it was like I was outside of my own body, unable to process it. All I could think, all I could feel, was the silence after the crash. And then, the pain. I tried to move, but everything felt heavy, my body unresponsive. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought maybe I was dreaming. Maybe this was just a nightmare, and I'd wake up any second. But I didn't wake up. The reality was too real. The cold air outside my car, the pain in my chest, the ringing in my ears, those things were real. And I wasn't sure I was going to make it out of this. I could hear sirens in the distance, growing louder by the second. And then the voices, strangers, telling me to stay still, not to move. They were trying to pull me out of the car, but I was so disoriented, I couldn't process what was happening. All I could think about was him. Was he okay? Had he heard about the accident? Did he know where I was? And then, in the chaos of the crash, I felt the reality of what I had been doing, the lies, the affair, the choices I had made, catching up with me. And I wondered, is this how it ends? Is this what I deserve? Had I gone too far, and now I was paying the price? The paramedics were quick. I remember them carefully extracting me from the car, asking me questions that I couldn't answer. But I didn't care. I didn't care about anything in that moment except the overwhelming rush of pain that was coursing through my body. The pain was sharp, like it was coming from all directions at once, and it took everything I had to stay conscious. I heard one of them mention something about a head injury, and that's when it hit me, I didn't know what had happened. I didn't know if I was going to survive, if I was going to walk out of that accident. And suddenly, in that moment of fear, I realized that my life, everything I thought I had, everything I had done, could all be over in an instant. I was rushed to the hospital, the world spinning around me. My mind was foggy, my body was numb, but I couldn't shake the thought, this is it. This is the consequence of my actions. This is the price I had to pay for every lie, for every decision that led me to this point. Hours later, after the doctors had stabilized me, I woke up in a sterile hospital room. The beeping of the machines around me was the only sound. It took me a few moments to get my bearings. My body ached, and my head was pounding, but as I slowly sat up, I realized something. I was still alive. I had survived. But I couldn't help but wonder, why? What did this mean? Was it a wake-up call? A punishment? Or was it just a cruel twist of fate? And then it hit me like a ton of bricks. If I had died that day, would anyone have even known the truth? Would anyone have ever known what I'd done? The affair, the lies, the betrayal? Or would it all have remained a secret, buried with me, never to be uncovered? But even as I lay there, battered and broken, I knew that the accident wasn't the end of this story. It wasn't the end of the lies, or of the choices I had made. It was just the beginning of something far bigger, something that would come crashing down whether I was ready or not. And in the days that followed, when I finally got the chance to speak to him again, everything would change. The truth would come out, whether I was prepared for it or not. And I was about to learn the hardest lesson of all. When I was discharged from the hospital, everything felt unreal. The accident, the crash, the pain, it all seemed like it happened to someone else. But deep down, I knew I was no longer the person I had been before. The facade I'd worked so hard to keep up was crumbling. And it wasn't just the affair I had to face, it was everything I had been running from. I had been living in a lie, and now it was all falling apart. I spent the first few days after the accident in a daze. My husband was beside me, being the perfect partner, but I could see it in his eyes. He had no idea what had really happened, and I wasn't sure I was ready to tell him. Every time I looked at him, guilt gnawed at my insides. The sweet man who had always supported me, loved me, and stood by me, and yet, I had betrayed him in the worst possible way. But it wasn't just him I had to face. It was myself. The more I thought about what had happened, the lies, the deception, the more I realized that the woman I was trying to become was far removed from who I had once been. I didn't recognize myself anymore. The person I saw in the mirror wasn't the wife, mother, or friend I had once been. She was a stranger, someone I was ashamed of. The days bled into one another as I recovered physically. I spent hours in silence, staring out the window, watching the world go on while I was stuck, trapped in my own mind. But every once in a while, I'd get a glimpse of him, the man I had been seeing. My affair partner. He came to see me, of course, and while his visits should have comforted me, they only reminded me of the mess I had created. He wasn't a bad person. At least, not in the way I had imagined at first. He was someone who had his own life, his own problems, his own reasons for being in this situation. But as much as I cared for him, I realized something that hit me like a ton of bricks: he wasn't my solution. He wasn't the answer to everything that was wrong in my life. He was just part of the problem. It's strange, isn't it? How we often look for answers outside ourselves, whether it's through a person, an affair, a fleeting connection, hoping that someone or something can fill the emptiness inside. But in the end, it's always the same. You're left with yourself. And I had to face the fact that I had made choices that would change everything, that would destroy everything. I didn't know how to face my husband after everything. The guilt was unbearable. I thought about telling him, confessing everything, but every time I thought I was ready, I couldn't find the courage. I was terrified of losing him. Terrified of losing my family. Terrified of losing everything I had ever known. But that's the thing about secrets. They don't stay hidden forever. And sooner or later, the truth comes out, no matter how much you try to bury it. One afternoon, a week after the accident, he finally sat me down. I had been avoiding him, dodging his questions, hoping he wouldn't notice how distant I had become. But he wasn't stupid. He knew something was off. He had seen the change in me, seen how I had withdrawn, how I no longer looked at him the way I used to. And he wasn't going to let it slide anymore. I can't tell you what it felt like in that moment, sitting across from him, knowing that the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. His eyes, so full of concern, of love, now looked like they were trying to see through me. To see the truth. To see what I had been hiding. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but firm. His words made my heart stop. I knew what was coming. The question that had been hanging in the air for so long, the question I couldn't answer: what's been going on with you? In that moment, I felt trapped. Every lie, every word I had spoken in the last few months felt like it was suffocating me. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to confess everything, but I didn't know how. What words could explain this? What words could explain the fact that I had torn apart the life we had built? How could I ever make him understand? I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, the silence between us grew thicker, and all I could think about was the weight of my own shame. Then, unexpectedly, he did something I wasn't prepared for. He asked me, no, demanded, to tell him the truth. Not about the affair, not yet. He just wanted to know what was going on in my head. What had happened to the woman he married? What had happened to the woman who had promised him everything? That was when I realized something that took my breath away. He didn't know. He didn't know about the affair. He didn't know that I had betrayed him in the worst possible way. And in that moment, I was faced with the hardest choice I had ever made. Do I keep lying? Do I let this continue, pretending that everything is okay? Or do I finally admit the truth? I decided to tell him. Not everything, not all at once, but I knew I couldn't keep living the lie. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. So, I told him about the affair. I told him about the man I had been seeing, about the lies I had told, about the betrayal. As I spoke the words, I could see the shock in his eyes, the disbelief. But there was something else there, too, something I hadn't expected. Hurt. His heart was breaking in front of me, and I felt like I was the one shattering it. He didn't say much at first. He just sat there, processing what I had said. And as the silence stretched on, I began to wonder if I had just ruined everything, if I had just destroyed the last thing in my life that mattered. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. I don't even know who you are anymore, he said, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. How could you do this to me? To us? I had no answer. There was no excuse. There was nothing I could say that would make it better. I knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end of our story. It wasn't over yet. But it was the beginning of something else. Something that would change everything. And I had no idea if we would survive it. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. He was distant, angry, and hurt, and I couldn't blame him. But what happened next? I never saw it coming. The choices he would make, the decisions that would shape the rest of our lives. I couldn't predict what would happen next. But I would soon learn that nothing would ever be the same again. The days after I confessed were some of the darkest of my life. I could feel the tension between us, like a constant pressure in the room, as if we were both walking on fragile glass. The weight of my betrayal hung over every conversation, every glance. He was quiet, distant, processing the truth I had finally laid bare. I was bracing myself for the fallout. The anger, the sadness, the disappointment that I knew was coming. And yet, there was something else there too, a sense of numbness. Like he had already begun to shut me out before I even had the chance to explain myself fully. I didn't know what he needed. I didn't know how to fix this. And deep down, I was terrified that it was beyond repair. I wanted him to scream at me, to yell, to let out all of the anger I knew he must have been feeling. But he didn't. He just pulled away. It was as if the man I had known, the man I loved, was slipping away, and in his place was someone I couldn't reach, someone I didn't recognize. Every time I tried to talk to him, he'd nod, give me short answers, but his eyes, those eyes that once saw me as his everything, now looked at me with something I couldn't name. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even sadness. It was something colder. Something I couldn't wrap my mind around. He was shutting me out. And I was losing him. Days passed, and the silence between us grew louder. I had hoped that time would heal the wound, that the shock of my confession would wear off, and we could start rebuilding. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was no going back. Even if we stayed together, things would never be the same. Our foundation had cracked, and nothing could fix that. And then, one night, after a long and painful silence, he told me he needed space. He said he couldn't be around me right now. And as those words left his mouth, I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. It was as if everything had finally caught up to me, my guilt, my mistakes, my choices, and now, I was truly facing the consequences. That night, he left the house. He said he was staying with a friend, that he needed time to think. He didn't give me any promises, no assurances, no hope. Just time. And as I stood in that empty house, I realized that this might be it. The end. My marriage, my family, everything I had known, it was all slipping through my fingers, and I couldn't stop it. Over the next few days, I kept expecting him to come back, to reach out. But he didn't. There were no late-night calls, no texts, nothing. I couldn't stop thinking about what he was doing, where he was. Was he talking to someone? Was he already considering leaving me for good? Every time the phone rang, I jumped, hoping it would be him. But it never was. I spent hours replaying everything in my head. The affair. The lies. The way I had let him down. And every time I tried to justify my actions, I was met with the harsh reality that there was no excuse. I had betrayed him. There was no coming back from that. Then, a week later, he finally called. I could tell right away that something was different. His voice was cold, distant. He wasn't angry, but there was something in his tone that made my heart drop. He told me he was coming home. But he didn't sound like the man I had married. He wasn't excited to come back. He wasn't even relieved. He was resigned. "We need to talk," he said. That was all he said. And I knew that whatever happened next, whatever he had to say, it was going to change everything. When he came home, it was different. There were no hugs, no kisses. No sense of relief or happiness that he was back. Instead, he sat down across from me, and for the first time in days, we really looked at each other. But this time, there was a distance between us, an invisible wall that neither of us could break. I didn't know where to start. I wanted to apologize again, I wanted to beg for his forgiveness, but I knew better now. I couldn't fix this with words. I couldn't fix this at all. The truth had already been spoken. There was no going back. All I could do was listen to whatever he had to say. And that's when he dropped the bombshell. I had no idea what was coming, but when he spoke, it felt like the air was sucked out of the room. "I know everything," he said, his voice steady but filled with an icy calmness that chilled me to the bone. "What do you mean?" I asked, almost in disbelief. How could he know? I had thought everything was already out in the open, that he knew about the affair. I had told him everything, or at least I thought I had. But there was a look in his eyes, a knowingness that sent a shiver down my spine. "I know about the other man," he said, his words cutting through me like a knife. "The one you've been seeing behind my back. The one you've been lying to me about." I froze. My mind couldn't process it. How? How did he know? I thought I had kept that part hidden. I thought I had covered my tracks, that I had told him everything he needed to hear. But clearly, I had underestimated him. He had known something was off, even when I thought I was being careful. I had thought the affair was the only thing I was hiding, but there was more, so much more. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain? How could I tell him that I had been lying not just to him, but to myself as well? That the affair hadn't been the only betrayal. That there were other secrets, other lies I hadn't come clean about? How could I tell him that the entire relationship had been built on lies, and I had been too scared, too ashamed to admit it? I could see the pain in his eyes, the disappointment, the betrayal, and it hit me harder than anything else had. This wasn't just about the affair anymore. This was about trust. About love. About everything we had been to each other, everything we had built over the years. And I had shattered it all. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. He didn't even cry. But I could see it, he was done. He was done with me. He had heard enough. He had seen enough. And he had made his decision. At that moment, I knew it was over. The marriage was over. My family, my life, everything I had worked so hard to protect, it was all slipping away. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. But even as I sat there, feeling the weight of my choices crash down on me, there was still a part of me that refused to accept it. A part of me that didn't want to believe this was the end. But as he stood up to leave, he gave me one last look, one last cold glance, and I knew. I knew the truth had finally come to light. And now, the real consequences were about to begin. When he walked out that door, I felt a piece of myself go with him. Not just because I knew I had lost him, because I had already prepared myself for that. No, it was the finality in his eyes. That cold, distant look. The look that told me he had made up his mind, and there was no turning back. The man I had loved for so many years was gone. And I was the one who had driven him away. For days after that, I couldn't escape the guilt. It gnawed at me. Every waking moment, every quiet second when I thought about my family, my children, my life, the reality of what I had done overwhelmed me. I kept replaying the moments in my head, wondering if I had made a mistake by even confessing. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. The truth had to come out. It just wasn't going to save anything. There was no forgiveness in his heart, not for me, not for what I'd done. The house felt so empty. The silence was deafening. And yet, the moments I dreaded most were the ones when I had to face the inevitable, the confrontation. The moment when we would sit down and finally talk, truly talk, about what had happened, about where we had gone wrong, and if there was any way forward. But even as I prepared myself for it, a part of me didn't want to face him. I wasn't ready to hear what he had to say. Because deep down, I knew that no matter what, it wasn't going to be good. When he finally called, my heart stopped. He didn't say much on the phone. Just that we needed to talk. That was it. No explanation, no warning. Just the cold, final command to face him. That evening, I found myself standing at the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. I didn't know what was waiting for me on the other side. But I was afraid. Afraid of his anger, afraid of what he had been thinking. But more than anything, I was afraid of facing the truth. Because I knew, this conversation wasn't going to be about the affair. It was going to be about everything I had done wrong. Everything I had neglected. Everything I had taken for granted. As I opened the door, I saw him standing there. His face was unreadable. There was no emotion, no sign of the man I had once known. He was a stranger now, and I could feel the distance between us like an invisible wall. But despite all of that, despite the pain, I wanted him back. I wanted my family back. I wanted everything to go back to how it was, even though I knew that wasn't possible. Without a word, he walked past me, into the house. He didn't even look at me. And that silence, it spoke volumes. It was suffocating. I could hear the weight of everything he was holding inside. The disappointment, the anger, the hurt. And I knew it was all directed at me. I had caused this. I had brought us to this point. We sat down across from each other, neither of us saying anything. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. And then, he spoke. His voice was calm, but it was the calm before the storm. I don't know who you are anymore, he said. I don't know what I'm supposed to believe. I wanted to speak, to tell him that I was still the woman he had married, the woman who loved him, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was too much, too raw. All I could do was listen as he laid it all out. You've been lying to me for months, he said, his voice breaking slightly. You've been lying to my face, and I can't trust you anymore. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. Trust. I had destroyed it. The one thing that had held us together. It wasn't just the affair. It was everything. It was the lies, the secrets, the things I had kept hidden from him. And I realized in that moment that no apology, no explanation would ever fix what I had done. I had broken something that couldn't be repaired. He went on, his voice becoming colder with each word. You've hurt me in ways I didn't think were possible. I thought I knew you. I thought I understood you. But now, I don't even know who you are. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that I was still the person he had married, that I had made a mistake, that I was sorry, but I knew better. This wasn't about me anymore. This was about the destruction I had caused. The pain I had inflicted. And no matter how much I tried to justify myself, the truth was that it was too late. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. I could see the man I loved, the father of my children, unraveling before me. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. I wanted to fix it, to make it better, but I knew that the damage had been done. Then, he looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in what felt like forever. "Do you even understand what you've done?" he asked. His voice was quieter now, almost like he was talking to himself. "Do you understand how much you've hurt me? How much you've hurt our family? Our children?" I didn't know how to answer him. How could I? How could I explain the inexplicable? How could I make him see that I wasn't just a monster? That I wasn't some cold-hearted woman who had set out to destroy everything we had built? How could I make him see the pain I was in too? The guilt, the shame. The constant battle inside myself, trying to figure out who I was anymore. I wasn't excusing my actions, I couldn't, but I was dying inside, knowing that I had ruined the most precious thing in my life. His next words were like a slap across the face. "I don't know if I can stay in this marriage," he said, his eyes cold, his words final. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you." Those words hit harder than anything else. Because deep down, I knew he was right. I had pushed him to the edge, and I had no idea if there was a way back. I had destroyed the trust between us, and now, I was paying the price. For what felt like an eternity, we just sat there. The silence between us was deafening. Neither of us moved. Neither of us knew what to say or do. And I realized, in that moment, that this wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about the destruction of everything we had worked for. The years we had spent building our lives, our family, all of it, it was slipping through my fingers, and I couldn't stop it. Finally, he stood up, and I saw something I hadn't seen in so long, defeat. He looked at me one last time, a broken man, and said, "I need to go." And as he walked out the door, something inside me broke. I couldn't fix this. I couldn't make it better. All I could do was watch as my world crumbled, piece by piece. As he left, I knew it wasn't over yet. But I also knew that everything had changed. The decisions we were about to make, the paths we were about to take, would determine the future of our relationship. Could we survive this? Could we rebuild? Or was this the end of everything? As I sat there, staring at the empty door, my mind was racing. 1,000 thoughts, a million emotions, guilt, regret, fear, crashed over me. But there was one thought that kept repeating over and over in my head: I didn't know if we could come back from this. The days after the confrontation were a blur. I went through the motions of daily life, working, taking care of the house, trying to keep up appearances for the kids, but nothing felt real anymore. The world around me had changed. The familiar comfort of home, of family, felt like a distant memory. It was as though I was living in a different reality, one where everything I had known, everything I had loved, was now uncertain. I thought about the mistakes I had made, and how many times I had taken things for granted. I had ignored the signs. I had neglected him, ignored his needs, and instead focused on my own desires. I let myself get lost in an affair, thinking it would fill the emptiness I had been feeling for years. But all it did was create more destruction. And now, I was left picking up the pieces of a broken life. For days, he didn't contact me. I wanted so badly to reach out, to fix things, to tell him I was sorry, to beg him to come home. But I knew I couldn't. I had to let him decide what he needed. I had already taken too much from him. Now, it was his turn to decide if there was anything worth saving. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached out. A simple text. Just 3 words: "We need to talk." And I knew then that the moment of truth was upon us. I wasn't sure if we were going to talk about divorce, or if there was still hope for us. I didn't know if he would walk away or if we could somehow rebuild, but I knew one thing for sure: our lives, our relationship, were about to change forever. When we met, it was in the same place we had met so many times before, at our kitchen table. But this time, it felt different. The weight of everything that had happened was in the air between us, thick and heavy. He looked at me, and for the first time in days, I saw a flicker of something, sadness, maybe, or perhaps confusion. But the anger, the distance, it was still there. "I don't know if I can do this," he said quietly. "I don't know if I can forgive you. But I also don't know if I can walk away from everything we've built." I could hear the pain in his voice, and it broke me. It was the first time he had spoken so honestly about his own struggles. He had always been the strong one, the one who kept everything together, who made sure we were all okay. But now, I could see the cracks in his armor. And it terrified me. I wanted to beg him. I wanted to tell him how sorry I was. How much I regretted everything. But I knew, deep down, that the words would never be enough. The damage was done. The trust had been shattered. And no matter how much I wanted to fix it, no matter how many times I apologized, I wasn't sure if we could ever go back to what we were before. But then, he surprised me. He didn't say much more. He just looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. After a long silence, he said, "I'm not sure what the future holds for us, but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to fight for us, for our family. But you have to prove to me that you're worth it." And in that moment, I realized something. I had been so focused on the consequences of my actions, on the immediate fallout, that I hadn't considered the possibility of redemption. I hadn't thought that, maybe, just maybe, there could still be hope. But the road ahead wouldn't be easy. It couldn't be. If we were going to rebuild, it would take time, effort, and, most of all, trust. But the fact that he was willing to try, that he was willing to give us a chance, was everything. Over the next few weeks, we took small steps. He moved back home, but the distance between us was still palpable. We didn't jump back into our old routines. Instead, we spent hours talking about the affair, about everything that had led us to this point, about the mistakes I had made and the pain I had caused. And while those conversations were difficult, they were also necessary. There was no way forward without facing the truth, without confronting the damage that had been done. But it wasn't just about talking. It was about changing. I knew that I couldn't just apologize and expect everything to magically heal. Trust was something that had to be rebuilt, piece by piece, moment by moment. I had to show him through my actions that I was committed to making things right, to being the woman he deserved. It wasn't easy. There were days when I wanted to give up. Days when I wondered if I could ever make him see me as the woman I once was. But I kept going. And slowly, very slowly, things began to shift. There were small moments when I saw a spark of the man I had fallen in love with. Moments when we laughed together, when we shared something real. But it wasn't instant. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was work. Hard work. Months passed, and while things weren't perfect, we had found a new kind of rhythm. We were no longer the people we had been before the affair. We were different. Wiser. More aware of the fragility of trust, of love, of everything we had. And we knew that we had to keep working, to keep proving that we could be better. Not just for each other, but for our children, for our family. But even as we began to heal, I knew one thing for sure, our love story was no longer the same. The foundation had cracked, and there was no way to completely undo the damage. But maybe, just maybe, there was a new story to tell. A story of redemption. A story of second chances. A story of what happens when two people refuse to give up, even when it feels like everything has fallen apart. And while I can't say that everything is perfect, that we're completely back to where we were, I can say this, we're trying. We're fighting. And that's something I never thought would happen after everything I had done. Because sometimes, the only way forward is to look at the wreckage and decide that it's worth rebuilding. Sometimes, the greatest love stories are the ones that survive the greatest tests. I don't know what the future holds for us. I don't know if we'll ever truly be the same again. But I do know this, I've learned that love isn't just about the good times. It's about showing up when it's hard. When it's messy. When you've made mistakes that can't be erased. It's about choosing each other, day after day, and proving that you're willing to fight for what matters. So, if you're watching this, if you've made it this far, know that it's not too late to start over. Know that even when everything feels broken, there is still hope. It may take time. It may take work. But it's always worth it. Because at the end of the day, love, true love, is about fighting for each other, even when it seems impossible. Thanks for listening to my story. And if you're going through something like this, if you're facing the fallout of your own mistakes, just know you're not alone. And maybe, just maybe, there's still a chance to rebuild. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because in the next chapter, we'll dive deeper into what it takes to heal and rebuild after betrayal. But until then, take care of yourselves, and remember, love is not just a feeling, it's a choice. Keep fighting for it.